So, Deborah, I've heard that you host a podcast, correct?
Yes, I do.
So, what inspired you to start this platform, and what are some of the things that you've learned from this platform?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to start off by saying thanks so much for reaching out to me to talk about some of the work that I've been doing and the communities I've been building. It's a real pleasure to talk to other members of Generation Z. It makes me really happy. But I started the podcast because of a conversation I had had with a friend, because I was interviewing them for a section of my book 2 years ago. And he was like, we just had such a great conversation. You should start a podcast. And it was in August at the time. I was just about to get ready to publish in February. And I was like, yeah, that'd be cool. That'd be really interesting. But I don't have time right now. I'm working on my book. But, after the book came out, the pandemic then happened. And so a lot of the tour was moved virtually. And I ended up doing a lot of podcast interviews on other podcasts and then going to different conferences and speaking. And then in June, I was like, I want to start this podcast. It was a New Year's resolution for 2020. And then I joined this program called the Amplify Melanated Voices Scholarship. And that was where I met my pod sister family. And it was born out of my coach's desire to help Black women create podcasts and give them the support and knowledge and resources that she wished that she had when she was starting. And so from that, I was like, I really, really want to have a podcast where I'm just talking about things that are affecting my generation, talking about things that I care about, and then spotlighting other young people and showcasing just how incredible our generation is, regardless of whether or not you consider yourself to be the most incredible person in your community or in your neighborhood. And just being a member of this generation in itself, like that is a remarkable thing. And I wanted to showcase that. So it's been such an incredible and fun journey. A lot of people enjoy hearing stories from a college student in a pandemic. And so just being able to share has been one of the biggest fun parts of hosting a podcast, because you'll hear from a lot of podcast hosts that speaking to yourself is kind of like therapy. And I can definitely relate, because you'll talk things through out loud and you'll have an outline, but then you'll learn things that you didn't even realize until you say it. So
yeah, I think you touched on so many important things, and especially our generation having a platform to make our voices heard, because it's such a different time from other generations. And also with all the people that you talk to for your podcast and your book, what's the biggest lesson that you've learned about the power of humanity and the power of the people?
I think there's two things that we cannot live without, and that's connection and creativity. And in all five of the people that I interviewed, and even in 2020, like that was something we all realized that we desperately need: a desire to truly and intentionally connect with people, and then also have an avenue to create in a way that doesn't feel forced, but rather in a way that's really sacred to us and really personal, like an outlet. And so I think that's where the common thread of humanity is, because when we put those two together, we're able to allow ourselves to play, we heal our inner child, and just connection and creativity are two of the biggest things that I took from 2020 and even from those interviews. And they're the biggest parts of our humanity that we need to continue doing, because it's daily work. It's not just a one-time thing, a one-time break. It's continuing to want to make connections with people just like we're doing right now, and create things that make us excited and happy about being here.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. I've also felt it like you can go just scrolling on your phone or researching things, and just sometimes you can feel so forced and just kind of stuck in the internet. But once you kind of take the time to be creative and just talk to other people, it really opens up a lot. And so I definitely agree with you on that. And so taking into account our Generation Z's activism with racial justice, climate change, and just so much more, do you think that other generations tend to underestimate us?
Oh, for sure. I think they're scared because they know that we're realizing things about ourselves. They're terrified. But we're realizing things about ourselves that they are realizing, or that they realized 10 years ago, like when they were in their 20s or their 30s. And when you make a connection with who you are and find spaces of belonging and understand what it means to belong in general at a younger age, it's easier to go through adulthood because you're not just stumbling through trying to find your way. And I think what our generation has done really well is to try to pursue change and impact in a big way, but not to do it alone. And I think that's what all the other generations were kind of doing. Not every single person in them, but it was always a spotlighted movement on one person instead of focusing on the collective impact that we have together. And that's what Gen Z, that's what we're kind of all about. You know, like, we know that we're powerful as individuals, but when we come together and we talk about things that really matter and do the hard inner work to get to the change that obviously isn't where it is right now, and wanting to create the world that we want our kids to be in, I think that's what drives us. And so they think that we're lazy. They use technology to like put us in a box, but we're using tech for good. We're using it to really fuel the movements that we're passionate about, from climate change, education, advocacy, gender equality, all of the different forms of activism. We're using it in a very powerful way to connect with one another, and then also to just get the change even faster.
Yeah, I agree, because I've seen that like people always try to use social media as like, all you do is like scroll through TikTok, you don't do anything.
Yeah.
But I think social media is such a critical part of how our generation's been able to educate each other and progress through so much change. And really just a lot of movements, they started through social media. And I think although social media does have some of its downfalls, there are a lot of benefits that people often disregard.
For sure.
And yeah, so also with this month is Black History Month, and we have our first female African American and Asian American vice president. And do you think, in terms of diversity, what do you think are some opportunities for growth in diversity in the United States?
I mean, I immediately think of the Senate. We don't have any Black women in the Senate, and that blows my mind. We need to get Black women in the Senate, because when Black women are in positions of power, we get it done. We look at Stacey Abrams and so many other Black women in Georgia, and it blows my mind how people don't realize that investing in our community invests in everyone, because we're doing the work for everyone. And then the other way that I think, beyond, you know, the presidency, is the local level. I'm always striving to get people to pay attention to their local politics, because the state that I'm in right now, and even the state that I'm from Delaware, we've never had a Black governor, ever, or a female Black governor, never. And so it's like, we need to get down to the local level if we really want to have a conversation on representation, because the problem that we're seeing with some of Biden's cabinet, and even with how problematic things are with the presidency, like, we don't just want identity politics to be what's driving the change, because we want people who not only look like us, but also have the progressive ideologies to get us to where we need to be, and to be committed to working towards that on a lifelong basis, not just, oh, she's a Black senator, so she's automatically going to fight for me. So I think that in terms of diversity, and even in progress and representation, we're inching towards it. There's so much progress that needs to be done. But I even think about the classrooms. Like, most of my educators are white. And that's a form of power, because that's where we learn whose words we care about, whose books we care about, who we trust, whose language matters. And so I think the United States has a very, very long way to go in terms of representation, because it's one thing to have representation and to feel represented, and that's what's missing.
Yes, you touched on so many important points, especially I think one of the biggest problems now is definitely identity politics. Like, sometimes I realize I've subconsciously done this without even thinking about it, like, oh, she looks like me, so she must be good. But people just often tend to, since there isn't that much representation in the first place, you don't have that many options of people who look like us. We just kind of go towards the first option that we have without really analyzing what they stand for and what they plan to do. So I think that's so important. And also with your book, so you wrote a book, and you were self-published or just published?
I published with New Degree Press, which is an assisted publishing company in DC.
That's amazing. And how was that process like? And what did you learn from publishing your first book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm approaching my 1-year anniversary on February 21st. So lots of memories are gonna come. Thank you. I grew so much as a person, and I wrote it during the spring and the spring of my junior year. fall of my senior year. So it was around the time where the pressure was really on. I learned how to manage my time like nobody's business. And I'm trying to bring those skills back with me now that I'm in college. But whenever people say that their projects were their babies, like I always go back to this Elizabeth Gilbert quote where she's like, the things that you create are not your babies, but you are the baby of them. Because I developed and grew so much from the start, from just the very idea, because that's how the publishing company works, from the idea of what I wanted to write to the end product of what I held in my hands on like the 21st, just like, oh my goodness, I wrote this book. And like, it's not even just the fact that I'm holding this thing. It's like, I'm an entirely different person than who I was when I started writing that. And so I love sharing and talking about the stories from the book. Like I even spoke to a state senator from Delaware on education and even like the problem in our social studies departments across the country and students and teachers. And I really wanted to get a community perspective on what it means to redesign education. And I would have planned for a pandemic. You know, I didn't even see that coming when my book published, like that we actually had the potential, and we still do a little bit now, but we had the potential at the onset of the pandemic to make a decision on whether or not we were going to continue to do education the way we had before, or we were going to do education in a new way that allowed students to, one, acknowledge the trauma that's coming from missing different experiences, connecting with people, and, you know, getting to make memories in the way that they were promised, and instead remake it in a new way that doesn't take away from what we could have had. But instead, I feel like we went right into emergency pandemic learning. And even now, with the way that school is, it's basically like regular school, but they're like, you're at home, so you have all the time that you need. And it's like the opposite. I have less time than when I was in school, because I have the responsibility now that I've never had before, especially when I have asynchronous classes versus the synchronous ones, to decide when I want to do these things. When maybe I would much rather be creating something, or, you know, recording an episode for the podcast, or hanging out with a friend, or sleeping, you know. So it's like, we had a very, very huge opportunity to redesign education in a form of, there's an educator who said like restorative justice. That's what we could have done in the fall. A restorative justice curriculum, acknowledging the flaws of the past education system and how it overworks us and makes us, you know, it just puts our mental health in a very bad place because it puts so much emphasis on the grades. And that emphasis hasn't been taken away. Some teachers have decided to, you know, move from tests, but that's not the majority. The majority of teachers are still administering tests as if we're not in a pandemic. And that's a very big problem. And so a lot of people have asked me if I'm going to write another book about pandemic learning and the pandemic education system. But honestly, like, I think that a lot of the things that I said in the book about redesigning education came at the right time and at the right place, because it's a student framework and student guideline that not just has personal development tips for like members of Generation Z, but also for policy members who want to see what can we do and what needs to be done, what's missing from education, and how can we make sure that we're not doing the same thing that we've been doing for years and years and years, and instead we're creating something that our generation will have to reform and redesign in the future.
Yeah, I think that's so important. There's just so much work to do with the education system as it is today. No, and even beyond the curriculum, but even the way that it's being taught. And I feel like it's not really being addressed at all, pretty much. And I think you're right. There's just so much work that we could do on that. But I think that writing a book about it and really just getting your voice out there is exactly what Generation Z is about. And I think that's amazing. And if you had any tips for any listeners who are interested in maybe writing a book, or they want to learn about the book writing process, what quick tips would you give to them?
Oh, I could do a whole podcast episode on this. I'm actually planning on doing one on this specifically, but I guess the shorthand version would be like, definitely do your research ahead of time. And then I would recommend finding a group of people who you could use as your better readers, better authors, people who read your work, to see what you have and then just keep writing. You know, there are going to be days where you feel discouraged, where you procrastinate. Every author and every writer does it, but it's like, once you make the decision to follow this path of writing and being a writer, you already are a writer. You don't have to wait for some magical certificate to be given to you or a grade or anything. Once you decide to be a writer, you are. And so own that identity as a writer and use it in everything that you do, in the moments where you feel frustrated and tired, and maybe create like a why statement, like why you want to write this book, why you're interested in the topic that you're writing on, and who is really going to benefit from your message and what you have to say. And there's always going to be someone. You just have to think a little bit hard of who's going to benefit and who's going to really value the message that you bring. And so I think once you have those three things, like in those moments where you feel unmotivated, it'll just pick you back up. Maybe not completely, because, you know, we have our low moments, but just create that why statement. So when you feel discouraged, you have something to come back to.
I think that's probably some of the best advice I've heard about staying motivated when you don't feel like doing something, because I think that's super helpful for writers, but even other creators, anyone, create a why statement, because often if you don't know the why, then you probably shouldn't be doing it, or you should probably maybe find something else and focus on your passions. And I think that you really explained that so well. And for our last question, if the whole world was listening to you right now, what would you say?
Such a good question. Oh my goodness, I gotta take a minute to think about that.
You can take your time.
Oh my goodness. I was just talking about this with my mentor yesterday. I think that as a community, as a society, we need to define what it means to belong for ourselves, and then also understand what it means to belong for other people, and then create spaces of belonging, because you are your home, whether you like it or not. You know, you don't always have high moments. We're not happy all the time. Of course, like batteries, there's a positive and negative side, but I think that there's so much work that needs to be done in terms of what it means to belong in spaces, what it means to create a sense of belonging, especially for Black women, for people of color. And once we get closer to that definition of belonging, because it's a lifelong definition that continues to evolve as we grow as people. I mean, I would just tell the world to keep at it, you know, to keep having conversations on belonging, on what belonging means, to create spaces of belonging, to listen to people, to hear what it means to belong, instead of, it goes back to the conversation of representation, you know, feeling represented versus having the representation. That's a big part of belonging. And so I would just say, let's define belonging together, and then also listen to what people have to say so that we can belong.